Nós, estudantes do curso de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do grupo de estudo sobre conflitos internacionais, em parceria com o Democracy Now!, apresentaremos as principais notícias da semana.
A partir de agora, com legendas em português, vincularemos os principais destaques internacionais.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
On Monday, I stood in front of your office with Addie Barkan. I told the story of my sexual assault. I told it because I recognize in Dr. Ford's story that she's telling the truth. What you are doing is allowing someone who actually violated a woman to sit in the Supreme Court. This is not tolerable.
Sexual assault survivors confront key Republican Senator Jeff Flake, prompting him to delay the vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh as Supreme Court Justice by calling on the FBI to reopen its investigation into allegations Kavanaugh attempted to rape Dr. Christine Blasey Ford in 1982. We'll speak with Ana Maria Archila, one of those who confronted Flake in the elevator. Meanwhile, Democrats say the probe is too limited. Critics say Kavanaugh committed perjury, lying during his testimony.
The question really before the Senate should not be whether he should be elevated to a lifetime position for the next several decades, deciding cases that affect everyone, but whether he should even be on the federal bench.
We'll speak with Lisa Graves, co-director of Documented, which investigates corporate influence on democracy, and we'll talk to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw of the African American Policy Forum, who advised Anita Hill in 1991 when she accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. Crenshaw says we still haven't learned from Anita Hill's testimony.
This whole two-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit. Revenge on behalf of the Clintons and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. This is a circus.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. As far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves.
Kimberly Shaw, from Clarence Thomas to Brett Kavanaugh. All that and more coming up. Kimberly Crenshaw. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The FBI is continuing its reopened investigation into Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. The focus of the probe is on allegations made by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford that Kavanaugh attempted to rape her in 1982. But the FBI has also reached out to Deborah Ramirez, a former classmate of Kavanaugh's at Yale, who says he thrust his genitals in her face during a party. The FBI probe was launched after Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona announced he would not support Kavanaugh's confirmation on the floor without a new investigation into the allegations.
I have been speaking with a number of people on the other side. We've had conversations ongoing for a while with regard to making sure that we do due diligence here. And I think it would be proper to delay the floor vote for up to, but not more than 1 week, in order to let the FBI continue to do an investigation limited in time and scope to the current allegations that are there, and limited in time to no more than 1 week. And I will vote to advance the bill to the floor with that understanding.
Senator Jeff Flake's remarks shocked his Republican colleagues who were hoping to quickly push ahead with a full confirmation vote for Kavanaugh on the floor. Flake's move to stall the vote came just hours after he was confronted in a Senate elevator by two survivors of sexual assault.
That's what you're telling all of these women. That's what you're telling me right now. Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're telling me that my assault doesn't matter, that what happened to me doesn't matter, and that you're going to let people who do these things into power. That's what you're telling me when you vote for him. Don't look away from me. Look at me and tell me that it doesn't matter what happened to me, that you'll let people like that go into the highest court of the land and tell everyone what they can do to their bodies.
We'll speak with the woman you're listening to right now, Ana Maria Achila of the Center for Popular Democracy, later in the broadcast. The White House is now facing criticism for placing limits on the FBI probe. According to NBC News, the FBI witness list does not include Julie Swetnick, who says she observed Kavanaugh at high school parties in the 1980s, joining efforts to inebriate girls so they could be gang raped. The New Yorker magazine reports the FBI has failed to follow up with several individuals who want to speak to the FBI. Meanwhile, a friend of Brett Kavanaugh's from Yale has accused him of lying about his drinking habits in college. Charles Ludington said, quote, "When Brett got drunk, he was often belligerent and aggressive. On one of the last occasions I purposely socialized with Brett, I witnessed him respond to a semi-hostile remark, not by diffusing the situation, but by throwing his beer in the man's face and starting a fight that ended with one of our mutual friends in jail," Ludington said. A number of other of Kavanaugh's Yale classmates have made similar remarks about Kavanaugh's drinking. Last week, one of them, Kavanaugh's classmate at Yale, Louisa Gary, withdrew her support for Kavanaugh. She has been featured in an ad by the Judicial Crisis Network that has been running on television. In Indonesia, the confirmed death toll from Friday's earthquake and tsunami has reached at least 844. It's expected to rise into the thousands as rescuers are just beginning to reach some of the more affected areas on the island of Sulawesi. The 7.5 magnitude quake toppled hotels, mosques, and shopping malls in the city of Palu. Landslides buried entire nearby villages. The United States and Canada have reached a tentative deal to save NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The new trilateral deal will be known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In a victory for American dairy farmers, Canada has agreed to open part of its dairy market to U.S. imports. The new deal does not resolve a dispute over U.S. tariffs on Canada's steel and aluminum exports. The proposed deal must now be ratified by lawmakers in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Lori Wallach of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch criticized the new deal, saying, quote, "Unless there are strong labor and environmental standards that are subject to swift and certain enforcement, U.S. firms will continue to outsource jobs to pay Mexican workers poverty wages, dump toxins, and bring their products back here for sale," Wallach said. In Brazil, tens of thousands of people took part in women-led rallies in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and other cities Saturday to protest against the far-right presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro ahead of the October 7th Brazilian election. Bolsonaro is currently leading many polls, even though he was forced to stop campaigning after being stabbed last month. Bolsonaro is a former army officer who's openly praised Brazil's military dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 1985. He said he used his government housing allowance to pay sex workers, called women weak, threatened gay people with violence, and called a political opponent too ugly to rape. The theme of Saturday's protest was "Not Him."
My name is Jade, and I'm here because Bolsonaro is dangerous. He represents hatred for our country because he represents the loss of the few rights that the people he targets, such as the black people, the indigenous people, and the LGBT community and women have conquered so far. He represents a threat to democracy in our country, a democracy that we are still building.
In news from Gaza, Israeli soldiers fatally shot 7 Palestinian protesters on Friday and injured more than 500 others taking part in a protest. The dead included 2 Palestinian boys, aged 12 and 14. Israeli soldiers have killed at least 190 Palestinians in Gaza since the Great March of Return protests began in March. Meanwhile, Palestinians in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza have launched a general strike today to protest against Israel's new Jewish nation-state law that declares only Jews have the right of self-determination in Israel. During a rally in West Virginia Saturday, President Trump heaped praise on North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, saying the two of them have fallen in love.
When I did it, and I was really being tough, and so was he, and we would go back and forth, and then we fell in love, okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters. We fell in love. But you know what? Now they'll say, Donald Trump said they fell in love. How horrible. How horrible is that? So unpresidential.
In news from Burma, the families of 2 imprisoned Reuters reporters have asked for a pardon. The reporters were detained in December while they were investigating the killing of 10 Rohingya Muslim men and boys by security forces and local Buddhists in Burma's Rakhine state. On Friday, supporters of the Reuters reporters held an event at the United Nations. Speakers included their attorney, Amal Clooney.
This case is about much more than just 2 innocent men. I mean, if you care about press freedom, you care about this case because it sets a precedent. So if these people are locked up, then other people are too scared to do the kind of reporting that they do. In too many countries around the world, we're seeing autocratic regimes lock up anyone who criticizes them and use a whole host of laws to basically criminalize speech and quash dissent. And you have to fight every single time that happens.
In environmental news, the Trump administration's taken a number of steps in recent days to roll back environmental regulations and oversight. The New York Times is reporting Acting Environmental Protection Administrator Andrew Wheeler has completed a proposal to dramatically weaken a major environmental regulation covering mercury, a toxic chemical emitted from coal-burning power plants. Meanwhile, the Interior Department has proposed loosening major offshore drilling regulations that were put in place after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil rig disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. This all comes as the EPA has announced plans to dissolve its Office of the Science Advisor, which was created to give the head of the EPA sound advice about scientific research. In immigration news, the New York Times is reporting the Trump administration has begun transferring detained migrant children from shelters across the country to a barren tent city in West Texas. The Times reports hundreds of children are being sent each week from shelters to the tent city, which currently houses 1,600 children. The U.S. government is now detaining a record 13,000 migrant children. A federal judge has ruled congressional Democrats can move forward with an anti-corruption lawsuit against President Trump. The suit accuses Trump of violating the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution by receiving payments from foreign governments through the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., and other establishments around the world. The Justice Department sued the state of California Sunday night, shortly after California Governor Jerry Brown signed a net neutrality bill to restore Internet rules that were rolled back by the Federal Communications Commission last year. California's Attorney General, Xavier Becerra, defended the state law, saying California will not allow a handful of power brokers to dictate sources for information or the speed at which websites load, unquote. In other news from California, Governor Brown has signed legislation requiring all publicly traded companies based in California must have at least one woman on their board of directors by the end of 2019. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has announced she's openly considering running for president in 2020. She spoke on Saturday in Holyoke, Massachusetts.
It's time for women to go to Washington and fix our broken government, and that includes a woman at the top. So here's what I promise. After November 6th, I will take a hard look at running for president.
And on Friday, protests were held in Dallas and New York to honor slain Texas man Botham Jean on the eve of what would have been his 27th birthday. Jean was shot dead in his own apartment last month by a Dallas police officer who's now facing manslaughter charges. Protesters decried the killing of Botham Jean.
Another black man murdered by an off-duty cop. Both of them was murdered in his own home. After Officer Amber Geiger broke into his home, thinking it was her own apartment, and shot him to death. We are here tonight to say this must end.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know.
President Trump openly mocks Dr. Christine Blasey Ford at a rally just days after calling her a very credible witness, as the FBI continues its investigation into her claims that Judge Kavanaugh tried to rape her when they were both in high school. A group of mental health experts are calling for Kavanaugh to undergo a full psychological and substance abuse assessment before the Senate votes on his confirmation. We'll speak with Dr. Bandy Lee of the Yale School of Medicine.
As mental health professionals, we have been troubled by some of the signs that Judge Brett Kavanaugh has shown in his hearings, and therefore called attention to perhaps the need for psychological screens before nominees are appointed to the Supreme Court.
Then, as Brett Kavanaugh objects to being held accountable for his behavior in high school, we look at the criminalization of black and brown students that's led to what's known as the school-to-prison pipeline.
Well, the problem with the school-to-prison pipeline has gotten so severe that by the time black students get to high school, fully 75% of them would have been suspended or expelled at some point in their lives. And a majority of black males who fail to graduate from high school will end up in prison at some point in their lives.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Indonesia, the death toll from Friday's devastating earthquake and tsunami continues to rise, with the official toll now topping 1,400 dead. An Indonesian government spokesperson said rescue efforts continue as the risk of hunger, disease, and a lack of basic necessities pose new challenges.
2,509 people are heavily injured and being treated in hospitals. 113 people are missing, 152 people have been buried, and 70,821 people have taken refuge in 141 different spots.
A volcano on the island of Sulawesi, where Friday's earthquake occurred, has erupted, spewing volcanic ash into the air, further complicating rescue efforts from the tsunami and earthquake. Meanwhile, scientists are warning that rising sea levels due to climate change will make future tsunamis like last week's disaster even more destructive. In a major expose, the New York Times has revealed President Trump inherited his family's wealth through tax dodges and outright fraud, receiving at least $413 million in inflation-adjusted dollars from his father's real estate empire. The New York Times' 13,000-word investigative report found Fred and Mary Trump, Donald Trump's parents, transferred more than $1 billion in wealth to their children, much of it to Donald Trump himself, paying less than 5% of the $550 million in taxes they should have under inheritance tax rates. The Times reports Donald Trump helped his parents undervalue real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars in IRS tax returns. The Times also reports Trump earned $200,000 a year in today's dollars from his parents' companies beginning at the age of 3, with a salary that increased to $1 million a year after Trump graduated college and to $5 million a year when Trump was in his 40s. During the 2016 campaign, Trump repeatedly portrayed himself as a self-made billionaire whose only head start was, quote, a small loan of $1 million from his dad.
It's not been easy for me. It has not been easy for me. And, you know, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million. I came into Manhattan, and I had to pay him back, and I had to pay him back with interest.
In fact, the New York Times reports Fred Trump lent his son Donald at least $140 million in inflation-adjusted dollars, and much of it was never repaid. As the New York Times expose broke on Tuesday, the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance said it's opened an investigation into the Times' allegations of Trump's fraud and tax evasion. Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday the FBI is wrapping up its investigation into sexual misconduct allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, and that he's prepared to call a vote on President Trump's Supreme Court nominee by the end of the week.
We'll get an FBI report soon. It'll be made available to each senator, and only senators will be allowed to look at it. And that's the way these reports are always handled.
The Washington Post reports FBI agents spoke on Tuesday with a former Georgetown prep classmate of Kavanaugh's named Tim Gaudette. He hosted a party on July 1st, 1982, which investigators have been zeroing in on. According to his own calendar, Kavanaugh drank along with at least 2 other classmates who were identified by Christine Blasey Ford as present at the gathering when she was allegedly sexually assaulted. The investigation barreled toward a rapid conclusion as lawyers for Dr. Blasey Ford said they were baffled that the FBI has yet to question her over her allegations that Kavanaugh tried to rape her in 1982 when they were both teenagers. Lawyers for another Kavanaugh accuser, Debbie Ramirez, said Tuesday the FBI had not interviewed another 20 witnesses Ramirez has identified. Meanwhile, the New York Times published a letter Kavanaugh wrote to his high school classmates in the summer of 1983 as he planned a beach week celebration on Maryland's coast. The letter, which Kavanaugh signed FFFFF Bart, urges the classmates to, quote, warn the neighbors that we're loud, obnoxious drunks with prolific pukers among us, unquote. Kavanaugh was 18 at the time. Maryland had just raised its drinking age to 21. He signed the letter Bart, not Brett. Bart O'Kavanaugh is the name that his friend Mark Judge used in his book, Wasted. President Trump praised Judge Kavanaugh and mocked his accusers Tuesday. This is Trump speaking to reporters outside the White House.
Well, I say that it's a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of. This is a very difficult time.
Later Tuesday, President Trump mocked Dr. Christine Blasey Ford during a campaign rally in Mississippi, just days after he'd called her a very credible witness.
36 years ago, this happened. I had one beer, right? I had one beer. Well, do you think it was? Nope, it was one beer. Oh, good. How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know.
We'll have more on the fight over Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court after headlines when we speak with Dr. Bandy Lee, a forensic psychiatrist on the faculty of Yale School of Medicine, co-author of a letter by mental health professionals warning Kavanaugh's behavior is consistent with someone struggling with an alcohol problem. The UN's top court has ordered the United States to lift sanctions on Iran for humanitarian and medical goods and services, as well as agricultural goods and those linked to aviation safety. The Trump administration reimposed unilateral sanctions against Iran in May after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. has questioned the UN's court jurisdiction and is expected to move ahead with further sanctions against Iran next month. In Afghanistan, at least 13 people were killed and dozens more injured Tuesday after a suicide bomber targeted a campaign rally near the eastern city of Jalalabad. The Islamic State group later claimed responsibility for the bombing. It's the latest in a string of attacks on election-related targets ahead of parliamentary elections on October 20th. Ethiopian state media reports at least 44 people were killed over the weekend as rival ethnic groups clashed in the west of the country. Violence and widespread displacement have continued to plague the Eastern African nation despite recently elected Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's promises to reduce ethnic tensions and violence. He made history by signing a peace agreement with neighboring Eritrea earlier this year. First Lady Melania Trump continued her solo tour in Africa by visiting Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, a seaside fortress used by slave traders starting in the 17th century. The former slave dungeon is now a monument to millions of Africans cast into slavery. After her visit, the First Lady told reporters she signed the site's guest book, "Thank you for your warm welcome. With love, Melania Trump." The State Department confirmed Tuesday the U.S. admitted just over 22,000 refugees during the last fiscal year, the lowest number in 40 years. The number of refugees resettled in the United States was half of the Trump administration's cap for the year of 45,000, a number that itself would have been among the lowest on record. At least 34 refugees have drowned off the Moroccan coast, according to the UN. A local activist says authorities failed to respond to the shipwreck for 36 hours after it was reported. Tens of thousands have attempted the perilous journey from Morocco to Europe by boat so far this year. The UN has recorded 1,700 refugee deaths in the Mediterranean since the start of 2018. Back in the United States, cell phone users across the country will receive a text message from the president later today as part of a test for an alert system managed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Federal Communications Commission. Televisions and radios will also receive alerts shortly after cell phones. The system allows the White House to send text messages to cell phone users only in cases of emergency, but some are already raising alarm that Trump or another president may try to abuse the system. In Virginia, federal prosecutors have charged 4 white supremacists from California with conspiracy and inciting riot at the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville last August. U.S. Attorney Thomas Cullen said the men also engaged in acts of violence in their home state of California at a series of political rallies, dubbing them serial rioters. Last year's protests left activist Heather Heyer dead after white supremacist James Alex Fields Jr. plowed his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-racist protesters. In the wake of the rally, President Trump declared, "I think there is blame on both sides, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides," unquote. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela nossa página no Facebook ou pelo blog Terra em Transe.
Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá!